Hi, this is Ronan Schnittman, publisher of Fraudbeat, here with Chen Zamir. Chen Zamir just was newly appointed as head of fraud strategy at Sardine, the anti-fraud company. He is co-founder of Native Risk, the fraud strategy consulting company, and he is co-author of the soon-to-be released. Let me see if I have it right. Soon to be released Fraud Fighters AI Playbook, which should be an
Right,
interesting read.
right.
Hi,
Hopefully.
Chen.
Hi, Manan. Pleasure to be speaking to you once more.
Yeah, it's great to catch up. So I think today we're gonna talk a bit more about the basics. Uh, you also have a Saturday newsletter that you regularly put out. I think that you go into a bit greater detail for your followers, and we can plug that, I guess, in the description of the video. But today, let's go through the basics of what should be your fraud defense as a fintech on a basic level, on a like a theoretical setup, what it should look like.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. The basics, as you said. So I always look at it as three layers of defense. And actually, before we go into those three layers and understand like how this cake looks like and what it is made of, it is important to know that there's also like a baseline foundation that you need to set up in place before you even start thinking about defenses, and that is the data layer, right? So you want to make sure that your data is not only kind of like organized and structured and you have like full integrity for it and there's no like corruption or anything like that, but there are a lot of steps, especially in fraud prevention, steps of enrichment and feature engineering, where you want to not only look at the raw data that you have for a payment, for a sign up, for an account login, but you also take measures to enrich the data, right? Look at a specific IP and gain the intelligence of it. Look at a specific device and gain the intelligence on it. Do linking, entity resolutions, velocity checks. So there are a lot of things that you can do. We're not going to cover any of those today,
Hmm.
but the idea stands that before we even start like thinking about how we organize the defensive layers, we need to talk about our means, and our means are our data. So that would be the first thing, and we assume that this is in place to some degree of completeness. Um, Having said that, when I'm looking at an organization, I usually see three different approaches for fraud prevention. Uh, and I'm going to talk about them quickly by the evolution of fraud prevention methodologies.
Okay.
So if you look at the start, how this space started and how like the first fraud fighters committed fraud, you would mainly look at manual review and other forms of very manual processes. The idea is that one, you like every time that you make a decision, you make it on a specific case, a specific account, a specific payment, a specific user. Um, and mostly when you make these decisions, you make these decisions after you've manually reviewed it, investigated it, made sure whether this is a fraudulent attempt or a legitimate one, and then enacted your decision in a manual manner, right? So the process is manual end to end, and you might be today augmenting it with some tooling, might be even you're augmenting it with automation, even AI. But the basic idea is that you are making one decision over one case.
Yeah.
And meta review is, I would say, rather accurate, even though it got, an amazingly bad rap. I don't know why. I think ever since machine learning came into the space about a decade ago or so, no, sorry, actually 2 decades ago, I Yeah, time flies. Um, I think there was this assumption that AI, now when we're saying AI, we mean Gen AI and LLMs mostly. 10 years ago, we were speaking about machine learning. AI, the assumption was that it is accurate because humans make mistakes and AI or machines never make mistakes, which is a complete fallacy. But the point being is that, and we'll get to that in a second, the point is that manual review is pretty accurate, especially if you have like a trained team and you spend enough time and enough resources on every case. The problem with manual review is that it is not really scalable. It is very resource intense. It is very hard to scale it. And especially when you're considering how much volume businesses have today, definitely fintechs versus how much volume we had online 10, 20 years ago, you cannot really count on manually managing all of your fraud prevention processes in 2025, definitely not in 2026, which is probably when you're hearing this conversation or listening to this conversation. So that's manual review. Later, down the evolution path, we started integrating into the system rules. What are rules? Rules are expert-driven heuristics or logics that an expert, a human being, sat down, analyzed a subset of data manually, but then reached a kind of like um, uh, 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 um, I would say a higher level abstraction of the patterns, the fraud patterns that they've seen in the data, and they codify these abstractions as a logic. If the amount is higher than $100 and the IP country mismatches the credit card country, then block the transaction. That's, a simple, probably very inaccurate example. Um, and the thing with rules is that they are very scalable. Once I've made a decision, like once I've researched the rule, I can now uh, um, um, kind of like deploy it into production and it would make decisions in a very fast time automatically. And supposedly you can scale it very fast. But in reality, that's not really the case. In reality, we know that rules are static and especially simple rules like the one that I just described where, amount bigger than $100, fraudsters can very easily find out by a bit of testing what is the limit and start transacting twice for $50.
Yeah.
That's what I would do as a fraudster. And around these static thresholds and static conditions, fraudsters can reverse engineer your defenses and circumnavigate them. And then the real cat and mouse game begins. And suddenly you don't have 10 rules in your fraud prevention system, but you have 100 and 500 and even like 4 digit. And I've seen such systems. Um, so rules can be fast and scalable. They can be very, very accurate when you ship them. But because it is very easy to reverse engineer them, they also rot quite fast and they don't, or let's say you need to keep monitoring them and making sure that your system is always kind of like up to date with fraudsters. And then we get to the third layer, the third approach, which is machine learning. And I'm on purpose not speaking about AI. We'll probably get to AI later. Um, and machine learning brought a new concept.
Well, machine
And the
learning
point here
is
is,
part of AI, correct?
yes, I mean, depends on the definition and who you're speaking to, but I personally see AI as a wide field, and within AI you have machine learning models, which are more kind of like statistical based. You have generative AI and specifically LLMs
Yeah.
that are more kind of like textual based. You have diffusion models, which are more about image generation, and you have other fields, but the idea is that machine learning and LLMs, right, are two different fields with within AI. That's how I see it, but
Sure.
buzzwords and so on, yeah, it's hard to keep track. So in terms of machine learning, the new thing that machine learning brought with it is not necessarily the automation, because we already had that with rules. It is also not necessarily the scalability, because again, we had that with rules as well. Um, and I would even say that it is not so different than rules, because rules and machine learning are very similar in the sense that you need to research this solution, you need to test this and validate this solution before it goes live. And you need to do that manually with a very highly qualified talent. So for rules, it would be probably a data analyst, and for machine learning, it would probably be a data scientist. But still, you would need to go through this R&D process of developing this rule and validating it and deploying it. What is different then? The difference is that machine learning models, because they are statistical in nature and they don't follow very clear heuristics with very clear conditions, if transaction is above $100 and mismatch, da, 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 da. With machine learning models, you look at actually a lot of different data points, not just two, but hundreds, maybe thousands, maybe even tens of thousands of different data points. And you uh, feed all of those through a very complex formula that gives you some sort of a score, a statistical score that should represent how risky this event is. And you can now decide, if you have scores between 0 to 100, you can now decide that you want to decline everything above 50 or above 80 or above 95. That really depends on your risk appetite and business KPIs and so on. The point is that um, there isn't necessarily a very clear pattern that machine learning models catch, unlike rules. Um, but it is also very hard for fraudsters to reverse engineer it, because there are so many data points that are in play here. Um, I mean, it's like the black boxiness of machine learning, the fact that
Yeah.
users can't understand why the score was given to that event, why that score was given to that event. It also is as hard for fraudsters. So it is very hard for fraudsters to circumnavigate machine learning models. And so even though machine learning models would not necessarily be as accurate as rules when both go live, because they are statistical and less about finding the stories and the very kind of like clear-cut patterns, they degrade way slower, way, way slower than rules. Rules can, you can ship them, and after 2 days, the fraudster says, okay, you're onto me, so I'm just going to shift my behavior. And 2 days after the rule have been shipped, you can see a rule being dropped from like a very high accuracy to a very, very low accuracy, only producing false positives because fraudsters migrated. With machine learning models, statistical models, you usually won't see such a degradation, and definitely not so fast. We went through that very, very fast. How do you actually make sense of all of these three different approaches? Um, so here's what I see, and here's what I would recommend. What I see
Okay.
usually I would see organizations tend to stick to one of these approaches, one of these methodologies, and base their fraud defense based on that. Um, and there is some logic behind it. I always give this example. If I'm a luxury watches merchant and I'm selling, like 2 watches a day, but like 5-digit watches, right?
Yeah.
Uh, I don't need machine learning, like a fancy machine learning model for that. And likely that if I'm only making 2 transactions a day, I don't have the data to train a model. But it is completely fine as the business owner for me to spend 1 hour every day on each such transaction and manually reviewing that.
Yeah, for
It
sure.
makes sense. Yeah, the ROI makes sense. For a gaming company, especially like mobile gaming company, where there are a lot of microtransactions, and I have 20K transactions a day, and they are for less than $1 a pop, I cannot spend the time on reviewing these transactions. No, it doesn't make sense. So I see a lot of like most businesses that I come across, whether it is in fintech or in e-commerce, they would stick to just one of these approaches. But for a modern fintech that definitely one that is already starting to get mature and has A, traffic, B, global or at least regional reach. So it's not like very narrowed down on a very specific country, but it has multiple countries, multiple markets with very different behavioral patterns and very different products. Um, and also more complexity in terms of the products, right? Here, what I would recommend is always to build a system that is comprised of all three approaches. And why is that? Because as we just discussed, none of these approaches is, the silver bullet.
Yeah.
Machine learning models are not perfect. Meta review processes are not perfect. Rules are not perfect. So the way to kind of like make up for their deficiencies is to layer them. And the way that I always do that, I would start with a very broad machine learning model that sits at the base of my decisioning and kind of like segments my population. What is high risk? What is medium risk? What is low risk? And on each of these segments, I can now start building rules that would take care of the easy to spot patterns, like the very clearly bad, very clearly good or false positives that I can kind of like clean up automatically, especially when I utilize it together with my model score and leave a very, hopefully, a very small segment, a very small population of very hard cases that A, I'm not sure whether they are good or bad, and B, they are also, let's say, from a financial perspective, the exposure there is big enough for me or for it to be worth me spending the resources on manually reviewing these cases, right? So I'm not going to review a $5 payment. I want to review a $1,500 loan.
Excuse me,
That's the point.
let me jump in. So that it leads to an interesting question, I think that is coming out with AI. Um, you need to have skilled manual review people, analysts, to be able to handle the high value transactions, to understand whether they should be passed or approved or denied. But to get them to that level, you want them to start out with easier transactions that are sort of like, the things that you would train a machine on. So the question is, how do you get these skilled analysts to be a part of your layer cake, your defense system? Do you hire them from other companies where they started out with lower transaction values? Do you take a hit and you train them on lower value transactions? And just because it's part of the training process,
Yeah.
this is a little bit of us diving in a little bit,
Yeah.
but yeah,
So I think there are two parts for it, like the AI and the talent, right? Let me address the AI part first because I think probably a lot of the listeners are wondering why it's 2026 in what 7 days or 11 days. It's 2026. How come we are speaking about fraud prevention and layers and defenses and so on? We're not mentioning Gen AI and LLMs. So let me refer to that and then we'll move to the talent piece. I For now, I am not seeing LLMs or agentic AI actually creating a complete new layer in this cake as we described it. I actually seen AI augmenting and improving each of these layers separately. And the reason for that is I think that what AI can do is cover for um, human thinking, which is unstructured, or we can reason around unstructured data. We can reason around books and images and so on. We don't need like tables in Excel to make decisions. Um, and And where do you see like what manual processes do you see in these three layers that we just discussed? You basically see two. One, it's the investigation itself, mostly
right.
happens on the manual review side. And two, you see it in research and development, in R&D, mostly around rules and machine learning. And also, like, without getting too much into it, also in the data layer that we mentioned at the start. And I think AI can support, improve, maybe to an extent replace human efforts around these processes and actually make sure that complex systems are more in reach of of non-expert organizations. I think that what I've just described to create such a system requires, as you kind of like pointed out, very professional talent, very experienced talent. And I would say in the market, you either would sit in, top 10 market leaders or fraud vendors. Right. So that
Yeah.
that's pretty much it. You would say like the PayPals, the Coinbases, the Klarnas, maybe Amazon. That's pretty much it. But I think that AI would now uh, because it can substitute for experience, for domain expertise, for knowledge, all of these things, it will enable more and more businesses, specifically fintechs, to be able to spread their defenses around all of these three different approaches. Now, going back to your question about talent, this is a very tricky one. I think I don't think that this is new. I think it was always the case. I think Gen AI makes this an even more pronounced trend. But I do think that if you look at the kind of like spectrum of talent that you have on one extreme, you have the fraud specialists, usually investigators, usually very kind of like know very intimately fraud, but not that, let's say, data or technology literate. And on the other extreme, you have the data scientists that are very data and technology literate, but not necessarily domain experts. And I think the trend is for both of these extremes to draw into the middle and basically gain a more rounded, a fuller skill set. Again, I don't think that's new, but I think Gen AI makes it even more imperative. And I think both sides of the this talent spectrum, must, in order to be like top talent in the space, they must acquire this rounded skill set. And the reason why I'm saying that is because I think that fraud is a multidisciplinary problem that requires a multidisciplinary skill set. You need to know the problem very, very well. You need to be a domain expert. And sometimes it's not only about fraud, it's about, being an expert in your own business and the product or payments, right? There can be all sorts of domains. Um, but also to be able to translate these insights eventually into code in some form or manner. This code can be an AI agent prompt. It can be a machine learning Python notebook. It can be an SQL. Doesn't really matter.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's interesting. I think we covered already how AI sort of plays into the whole layer cake. I think what we're missing, the whole layer cake concept, I think we've also covered very well. I think the one thing we're missing in this conversation is what are the indicators, the KPIs that are indicators to you that something is going wrong with your layer cake, something is not
Okay. Yeah.
working.
Yeah. Good question. So I think Um, I don't wanna go into details when it comes to like the basic metrics, the fraud rates and the approval rates and the chargeback rates and so on. I would assume that every fraud team and definitely in fintech they know how to track the basic metrics, hopefully. A couple of thoughts about things that would help you manage fraud better and react to it quicker. The first one, which is always my go-to, and that is to look at your loss rate in a cohort's view. So not to like we know that fraud, especially in card payments, but not only, fraud is always a lagging indicator. Between fraud happening and me knowing, like getting the complaint, getting the chargeback, whatever, that can take quite some time and, definitely a month, right? At least a month
Yeah.
in most cases. So you want to be able to get a leading indicator that something is up in your system today without needing to find out about it in a month time. If it takes me a month to find out that I'm under a fraud attack, that's probably not good, especially by the way in fintech, especially by the way in fintech. And the way to do that is to track your loss rate by cohorts. And then, for example, I'm looking at the fraud rate that I had last week. Mostly, probably 90% of that is not mature. 90% of the fraud that happened last week, I didn't get the complaints, I didn't get the chargebacks. But I can compare how many chargebacks I did get, let's say 10, and notice that usually I get two chargebacks in the first week. So I can see that I have like an X5, even though the 10 chargebacks is like nothing, it's 10% of my fraud. And seeing this trend going up can indicate to any fraud organization that they are under an attack very, very uh, close to the attack starting. So that's the first thing that I always recommend. The second thing, also quite important, is to be able to separate between first-party fraud and third-party fraud, especially when these get the same kind of labels in our system. One example can be, a loan hasn't been repaid. Was it because the user who applied for the loan is, that was a stolen identity and it was a fraudster? Or was it someone who defaulted on their credit? Or was that like me and I never had the intention of paying because I don't know, I think I can get away with that. The label in my system would be the same label. The payment is not, sorry, the loan is not repaid, but what is the actual topology behind it? Same
Yeah.
thing with payments. If I get an unauthorized chargeback, is that really because a fraudster used my card, or is it because I'm saying a fraudster used my card and I want to keep the new MacBook and my money? So being able to separate, and there are all sorts of ways, we're not going to get into that now. Being able to separate what's first-party fraud and what's third-party fraud is also very important because sometimes I see fintechs that, they are seeing an uptick in fraud, but they are implementing the wrong measures because, they think it's third-party fraud, and they are, for example, increasing their KYC friction or creating all sorts of like 2FA friction with the customer, but it's actually first party fraud and all the customers are, like they
They're
can easily bypass.
they're passing through. Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Exactly. So understanding the topology to understand what is the solution is also quite important. And maybe the last one that I would mention would be what I would call fraud adjusted approval rates. And that is to basically, when you're measuring your approval rates, you want to also have a parallel metric that tells you how much of the good population is being approved. I'll give an example to make it a bit more concrete. Let's say that, I'll give an extreme example. Let's say that I'm approving only 90% of my payment flow. So 10% I'm declining. This is pretty poor acceptance rate. There's a different, like you would look at my performance very differently if I would tell you that the fraud attempts that I'm getting are 1% of my population. And so if I'm blocking 10%, 9% are good and 1% is bad, let's
Right.
say,
Yeah,
right?
that's awful.
Or exactly the opposite. I will tell you that 9% of what I'm blocking is fraud, and I'm only like blocking 1% good users. So and both can be like the case, right? Depends on the business and depends on the time, right? It can change week over week. So the idea here is that you don't want to create pressure for your fraud team to accept 95%, but in essence actually accepting all the fraud. So without knowing what is your fraud pressure and how much fraud you really have in the system, you cannot really set meaningful goals around that. So the way that I'm used to reason around it is to look at uh, just how many of the good users am I approving? And that doesn't change regardless of how much fraud pressure I have today versus last month. So these are the three things that I would usually, when I would come into a fintech, I would recommend of doing. So the leading indicators through cohort-based fraud maturation tracking.
Hmm.
The second one is splitting first and third party fraud. And the third one would be the fraud adjusted approval rate measures.
Okay. I think we've covered a lot in a short amount of time, which is great. So Chen, Zamir, thank you for taking the time to speak with us at Fraudbeat.
My
We
pleasure.
will put a link to your Saturday fraud strategist newsletter in
Correct.
the video description, and I think we also have for the AI playbook. The book
Awesome.
is
Yeah,
coming out.
the
We have
early release.
yeah, we have the excerpt, so we're gonna put a link to that as well. So thank you very much, and don't be a stranger.
My pleasure, and always.
Cheers.